July 13th, 1943. Yesterday, on the 12th, Operation Zitadelle, the Battle of Kursk, entered a pivotal moment. With the German offensive completely stalling in the north, all eyes turned to the fight in the south. Here, north of Belgorod, near the small village of Prokhorovka, the decision was to be made. Would the might of the German Panzers breathe new life into the failing operation? Or would their backs be broken by the hundreds of Soviet tanks waiting for their chance to strike?
And now, a word from our sponsors.
The Nazis hate them. Learn the secrets of history. Join the Time Ghost Army.
I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to a World War II extra regular episode. It's a busy week. Army Group South Commander Erich von Manstein's original plan called for the 48th Panzer Corps to overcome Soviet positions between Belgorod and Gersovka, then push towards Oboyan and finally into Kursk. Manstein was under no illusions that they had not allowed their enemies more than enough time to get comfortable. In the hills, gullies, and ravines, the Soviets surely would have deployed camouflaged guns, anti-tank ditches, mines, and mobile reserves, which they have. Looking down at the map, Manstein now wants to bypass Oboyan by executing a swing northeast and heading straight for the village of Prokhorovka. Here, he expects not only flat terrain, tank country, but also a likely place to draw out the Soviet armor. It is a risky plan, and for this, he commits perhaps 4th Panzer Army Commander Hermann Hoth's strongest fighting force, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, this corps has 3 Panzer Grenadier divisions, Totenkopf, Das Reich, and Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Elite, capable, and ideologically motivated, the Corps has an overall strength of 294 tanks and assault guns at the moment, with 179 field artillery pieces and a whole Nebelwerfer brigade in support. They are to drive an armored wedge into the enemy, Totenkopf in the north along the River Psel, and LAH and Das Reich to the south along the railway. They're supposed to be a mailed fist. But most of the tanks are Panzer III and IV models, and although upgraded, are too lightly armored to withstand a frontal assault for very long. Many hopes rest on the new Tiger, the Panzer VI. Its 88mm gun can destroy enemy tanks at a range of 1,800 meters, and its frontal armor is thick enough to just shrug off the 76mm shells of the main Soviet anti-tank guns. They are, however, slow, cumbersome, and mechanically unreliable. Still, if this is a poker game, Manstein holds a powerful hand. Soviet Commander Nikolai Vatutin is well aware that Hoth's forces have been eyeing Oboyan as their main objective before Kursk. However, unaware of Manstein's plan alterations, he has indeed been planning to let his mighty 5th Guards tank army enter the battlefield in front of Prokhorovka in order to strike deep into the flanks of the Panzers as they cross the Psel. So far, the Soviet defense-in-depth system has done its job, blunting and frustrating the Wehrmacht at every step, but the cost paid in lives and machines has been high. Vatutin can live with that, though. At the moment, he still has more than 600 tanks and thousands of artillery pieces of the 5th Guards Army and 5th Guards Tank Army at his disposal. Once deployed on the fields in front of Prokhorovka, he plans to seize the strategic initiative from his opponents. The front in this sector is quite narrow, like 30 kilometers or so, which leaves little room for tactical finesse. 5th Guards Tank Army Commander Pavel Rotmistrov thinks their best chance for success is with speed and overwhelming force. Around half of his tanks are T-34s, the other half mostly T-70s. At long range, they are inferior to the enemy's more powerful guns and better optics, so they must close in quickly. Soviet tankers load up as much fuel as they can, even slinging extra fuel cans onto the hulls despite the obvious risk. A tank running out of fuel here is a dead tank. The night of the 10th, while Hoth is still advancing on Oboyan, Hauser's corps begins shifting its axis towards Prokhorovka. On the 11th, Rotmistrov deploys his final tanks into position. Both armies are mostly unaware of the scale of the enemy force. But it is more and more clear that the success or failure of Citadelle will be decided here in the south. Will the Soviets hold on to their strongpoints at Prokhorovka? Or will the armored fists of the SS Panzer Grenadier divisions finally achieve a major breakthrough into open country? As the sun rises on July 12th, these questions are soon to be answered. The calm of the early morning is broken by the dull, throbbing sound of tank engines starting. Exhaust fumes and dust clouds are thrown up behind the waking giants as they warm up. It is 6 a.m., and Rotmistrov walks the lines. But just as he is about to give the signal to move out, a row of Bf-109s roars above his head. Behind them, Stukas and Heinkels break through the clouds, dropping bombs on his position. Hauser has struck first, and the Panzers of the Leibstandarte advance in an armored wedge. The battle for Prokhorovka has begun. The Soviet response is swift. A heavy barrage of artillery and Katyusha rockets rains down on the tightly packed German spearhead, forcing them to fan out. Then Rotmistrov sends out the code word, "Stall, stall, stall," and the assembled might of the Soviet tank force pushes forward with all haste. It doesn't take long for the Achtung Panzer call to blare over the German radio. For a moment, many Panzer commanders are awestruck by the giant avalanche of Soviet armor vomiting forth over the hills. But purple smoke shells are thrown into the enemy lines, and the German tankers go to work. The Panzer battle began. On separate slopes some 1,000 meters apart, the forces faced each other like figures on a chessboard, trying to influence fate, move by move, in their own favor. All the Tigers fired. The combat escalated into an ecstasy of roaring engines. The humans who directed and serviced them had to be calm, very calm. They aimed rapidly, they loaded rapidly, they ordered rapidly. At a distance of around 800 meters, the German tanks opened fire. With clinical precision, the heavy shells pierce Soviet armor and detonate. Still, the rapid advance of the 5th Guards Tank Army refuses to be slowed down, firing their 76 guns on the move. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughterhouse of tanks. We crawled back and forth and fired. Everything was burning. An indescribable stench hung in the air over the battlefield. Everything was enveloped in smoke, dust, and fire. In just minutes, the fields of Prokhorovka go up in flames. Armor and trucks on fire, tanks blowing up, razor-sharp metal flying through the air. In frantic panic, crews bail out of their steel coffins and burning men roll on the ground. Busted tanks fume like pressure cookers, with flames spouting out of the barrels as ammunition detonates within. Others are ripped to shreds by devastating direct hits, their turrets lifted several meters up into the air. Thrusting tanks, diving Stukas, burning Ratas, columns of smoke from the rocket launchers towering into the sky. Self-propelled heavy guns knocked out the Soviet tanks, the distraught faces of the captured, and time and again, the black mushrooms of smoke from countless explosions. That was the battle north of Belgorod. For 6 hours, the battle continued. On the sloping steppe, the Panzers, like knights in combat with horse and lance, would not let go. 10 times, 20 times, lightning, thunder, and smoke enveloped the giants. The commanders stared at the enemy through the slits. The radio operators sent and received messages and orders. The loaders wiped their oil-stained hands during a quiet second, pushed hair out of their face, and fed one shell after the other into the massive breach. At 9 a.m., the first phase of the battle concludes. So far, the Germans have stood their ground in the face of massive numerical superiority. LAH is hard-pressed in the center, but Totenkopf and Das Reich still execute some tactical moves on the flanks. Rotmistrov, however, is far from done. On his command, 5th Guard Tank Army's 2nd Echelon enters the field. After a barrage of artillery fire, the tanks surge forward to hit the Germans between the Psel and the railway line. As we waited to see if further enemy tanks were going to appear, I looked around, as was my habit. What I saw left me speechless. From beyond the shallow rise about 150 to 200 meters in front of me appeared 15, then 30, then 40 tanks. Finally, there were too many to count. After the wave breaks over the German defenders, the battle soon descends into several smaller engagements. Everyone fights for their lives as if pushed into a witch's cauldron. The heat between the burning tanks is unbearable, the noise worse. Machine guns rattling, grenades exploding, and shells penetrating or being deflected off armor. It is sheer madness. The Germans and Soviets entangled in this chaos can hardly tell friend from foe. The tanks of both sides were in closest possible contact. There was neither the time nor room to disengage from the enemy and reform in battle order. The shells fired at close range pierced not only the side armor, but also the frontal armor of the fighting vehicles. At such range, there was no protection in armor, and the length of the gun barrels was no longer decisive. The Soviet 18th Tank Corps becomes frontally engaged with the heavy companies of the Panzer regiments. The 170th and 181st Tank Brigades break into LAH's lines at Oktyabrski State Farm, heading towards the Psel in an attempt to destroy the bridges. Smaller groups of Soviet tanks break the German lines everywhere, threatening their artillery positions. German anti-tank gunners and infantry desperately try to hold on, even attacking the enemy with nothing more than teller mines and flame bombs as Soviet infantry and paratroopers infiltrate their lines. They were around us, on top of us, and between us. We fought man to man, jumping out of our foxholes to lob our magnetic hollow charge grenades at the enemy tanks. It was hell. Above the battlefield, the sky is full of dogfights. Despite the poor weather, the Red Air Force flies 893 sorties this day, the Luftwaffe 654. Stukas, equipped with 37mm cannons, tear into enemy tanks from the air. By the early afternoon, the battle decelerates. Both armies move like tiring heavyweight boxers, each hoping that the next punch will be the decisive one. But although the Germans are holding the line, the Soviets are slowly but surely gaining the upper hand. Facing a battle of attrition he cannot hope to win, Hauser chooses to force the offensive once more. He still has a considerable force of 121 operational tanks and assault guns available. By 2 p.m., Totenkopf has finally opened a gap in its sector, but has paid dearly for its gains, with only 54 tanks and 20 assault guns remaining. LAH is still pinned down by repeated attacks by 5th Guards tank reserves, and south of the railway, Das Reich has come under fire by the 2nd Guards Tank Corps. So as the day drags on towards its close, Manstein realizes that 2nd SS's advance is under threat of being fought to a complete standstill. Ammunition and fuel are in short supply, and the weather worsens by the hour. On the Soviet side, Vatutin has more reason to be optimistic. Although his casualties in tanks and men border on catastrophic, his forces still hold the Prokhorovka sector, which is his main objective after all. And while the German formations have lost half their strength or more, Vatutin can still rely on fresh reserves behind a belt of entrenched defenses and rows of murderous artillery. As night falls, so too does a lull over the battlefield as both sides rearm and refuel. But in the darkness, the first units of German 3rd Panzer Corps begin finally trickling in. There aren't many tanks yet, but if the Germans hold on, can 3rd Panzer tip the scales? July 13th, the 9th day of Citadel. Back at German headquarters, the mood is sour. In the face of repeated counterattacks by the 24th Guards Tank Brigade, Hauser has been forced to withdraw Totenkopf. This is followed by reports that Walter Model was withdrawing his forces in the north as the Oral salient is under heavy attack. Even worse, news comes in that the Western Allies have landed on Sicily. It is time for a decision. Manstein, summoned to Hitler's Wolfschanze headquarters, explains to the enraged Führer that there is still a chance of victory here. Although both Oboyan and Prokhorovka remain in enemy hands, they have dealt the Soviet 1st Tank Army and 5th Guards Tank Army a serious blow. If Hitler gives them additional reinforcements, they might still achieve a strategic victory before breaking it off. Hitler agrees at first, but after Manstein leaves, changes his mind. Frustrated, Manstein sets out to do what he can anyhow to achieve destruction of the Soviet armor south of the Psel. This is Operation Roland. Plain and simple, Hauser is to combine all his strength and the reinforcements of 3rd Panzer Corps to finally take Prokhorovka. Then they will execute a major encirclement between Lipovny Donets and the northern Donets and destroy the broken Soviet forces. After a massive artillery bombardment, Das Reich finally breaks into the first villages outside of Prokhorovka. With close air support, the Panzer Grenadiers engage in house-to-house fighting, taking the villages of Belanichino and Ivanovka in the coming hours. Now, just 6 kilometers short of Prokhorovka, the defending 2nd Soviet Guards Tank Corps is indeed close to breaking. Yet Vatutin still has more men and more machines to throw into the fray. Continuously reinforced, the Soviet defenders refuse to break and fight the German attackers once more to a standstill. Even with 3rd Panzer Corps in support, Hauser simply does not have the strength to continue. Demoralized, fatigued, and suffering from a rapid decline in fighting power after days of battle, the German forces are simply done. Operation Roland has failed. So just a few kilometers in front of Prokhorovka, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps must do what Clausewitz once called the most dangerous of all military maneuvers, the withdrawal from a hopeless position while in direct contact with the enemy. The Red Army, although suffering immense casualties and losses, has ultimately prevailed and denied the Germans their objectives. Adolf Hitler's hoped-for headline-grabbing and invigorating victory at Kursk has failed, and failed quickly, and now the Soviets truly have the strategic initiative. And beyond the Soviet Union, the Allied offensives in Sicily and the Central Solomons continue, and these will receive proper coverage on Saturday, as will the aftermath of the events of today. I have to point out here that while I do the research and writing for all the regular Saturday episodes, when we have extra weekly episodes, it is Marcus Linke who often, like today, does the bulk of the actual research and writes the first draft of the script. Thank you, Marcus. If you want more stuff like this from myself, Marcus, Sparty, and the rest of the crew, then join the Time Ghost Army at timeGhost.tv or patreon.com because the army is what pays for it. And if you missed the extra midweek episode at the conclusion of Stalingrad, you can see that right here. And even if you didn't miss it, then watch it again because that's a stone classic. Don't forget to subscribe. See you Saturday.